Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for March 1st, 2023. For some reason, the post of yesterday's update did not appear on Facebook, and of course we've had some problems related to me by people who are unable to find our posts. As I have mentioned before, you can always go to the LaRoucheOrganization.com to find the update. But since there was so much important material yesterday, I'm going to review some of that in the opening of today's update. So I hope it's not redundant for some of you, but it's important to understand the actual nature of the shift that's underway in the world. We're at a turning point in history. And as I've been arguing, the time for the liberal democratic order, and liberal in the terms of British liberalism, is over. It's being rejected and it's failing. Whether you call it a sole superpower, a unipolar order, the rules-based order, the only way it can survive is through imposition of military force against its opposition. And that's what we're seeing in Ukraine. This is not about sovereignty or freedom for Ukraine. It's about the ability of the financial cartels to use Western military power to crush any opposition. And the problem they have is that they're running into tremendous resistance to that from the countries they're trying to subvert. At the same time, the system is collapsing. Now, that's because this post-Cold War order, or the liberal order, is sometimes called free market or free trade system. But it's based on domination of the world economy by interlocking directorates of corporate cartels. They start with a rejection of sovereignty. That is, they will not allow nations to assert the sovereign rights to defend the standard of living and the interests of their people. Instead, they assert the primacy of the cartels to make profits over the needs of people around the world. It's moving toward having a global central bank to control credit. That's what the Great Reset is all about. Using using the central banks of nations, which are not national banks, but are actually private banks, but using the central banks to coordinate policy from the top. And credit will only go to those entities which are allowed by the corporate cartels. What happens when a nation opposes this? Well, this is what happened to Saddam in Iraq. He was not willing to submit and give up Iraqi sovereignty in order to please the international bankers. And he was investing Iraq's oil money in a development policy. And had that succeeded, it would have been an example to the rest of the world. So he was crushed based on lies that were made up by intelligence services to launch a genocidal war against the people of Iraq. Same thing with Libya. Gaddafi was talking about a gold-backed African currency that would be used to fund development of all the nations on the continent of Africa. Look what was done to him. U.S. NATO military intervention, which ended up with his gruesome murder. Now, NATO and the U.S. military were too powerful for those two countries. At the same time, the NATO and U.S. military are involved in regime change, coups, color revolutions, economic blackmail, and invasion to enforce the dominance of the so-called unipolar order. And what's the policy they promote? It's deregulation, privatization, deindustrialization, outsourcing to find the cheapest labor, and the Green New Deal, that is destruction of modern science and technology. And who benefits from this? The owners of the corporate cartels. In finance and insurance and real estate, we see companies such as BlackRock and Vanguard. The grain cartels, Archer Daniels, Midland, and others. Big Pharma, and so on, that create billionaires. And these are the ones who benefit from quantitative easing. That is, free money flows from the central banks to enable them to engage in the most speculative processes. But who pays for this? Well, until recently, the colonial sector, or the former colonial sector. in the form of cheap labor, cheap raw materials, and International Monetary Fund conditionalities. But now, increasingly, the middle class in the Western countries themselves are being forced to pay for this because the system is blowing up. There's too much debt, uncollectible debt, and yet they're continuing to build up the debt. And so you have the debt from the developing sector, which is unsustainable, and now corporate debt and family debt. And so the decision has been made to escalate, to use the so-called Great Reset to control from the top spending by governments to make sure that the credit is available for the speculative system, but not for the infrastructure, the food production, construction, and the needs of the general population. Now, this is becoming unsustainable as even the top bankers are starting to admit. I reported yesterday on an analyst at Morgan Stanley, which is one of the 4 biggest financial institutions in the U.S., who reported that markets are entering what he called a death zone created by a speculative frenzy. He said they're betting that the Federal Reserve will end quantitative tightening, which is higher interest rates, and return to quantitative easing, which is a flow of funds to cover over the bad debt. Now, you'll never end up paying off debt by creating more debt to pay it. They know this, but they're saying inflation is stubborn, so they're caught between quantitative tightening and quantitative easing. And what they're looking at, according to this source, is the danger of a domino-style collapse, default on debt. Now, the other problem is it was one thing to impose military force on Iraq or Libya, Afghanistan, or Somalia to keep this system alive. It's another thing to threaten to do that against Russia and China. Russia and China are asserting their sovereignty. They will not submit sovereignty, no matter how much the World Economic Forum demands it, no matter how much Biden and the leaders of NATO demand it. They are sovereign nations and will fight to defend their sovereign interests, including their national security. So what's the legacy of this policy? Well, after Iraq and Libya, the effort was made to destroy Syria. And the Syrians fought. The population fought. The government fought. And then Russia came in and defended the Syrians against what? Radical Islamic terrorist forces, Al-Qaeda and ISIS, funded and trained by the CIA and other intelligence agencies. So the people of Syria and the Syrian government and the Russians made sure that Syria was not subverted and turned into another state under the control of the cartels. And so what was done to Syria? Sanctions. Sanctions which now, in the aftermath of the earthquake, are killing people, killing them to punish them for resisting regime change. Now, we had a conference on this, and I'll link the video to that at the bottom of the description page. But what it shows is that countries can fight, and we in the West must demand the lifting of all sanctions against Syria, because this is a form of genocide being committed in our names, and we can't tolerate that. Now, in general, the Unipolar Order is running up against the resistance from the global South. These policies are unacceptable. And now that Russia and China are fighting, we're seeing new institutions that are being created that include the BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Eurasian Economic Forum, that are pulling together of countries to fight against the Unipolar Order. They will not submit. India is a part of this, Brazil, Algeria, Nigeria. These are countries that are saying we have our interests that we have to protect. And with Russia and China showing resistance, you now have a capacity for what they're talking about as a tectonic shift in world affairs. The one sign of this is the refusal of these countries to support sanctions against Russia. We see individual cases of Modi resisting the pressure on him to drop Russia. And instead, the BBC runs a slanderous documentary against him. We see the foreign minister of South Africa telling Blinken to stop lecturing her. She said, "We are a sovereign nation and we will not be bullied." And we see other examples. Now, also, these regional and multinational institutions like the BRICS are moving toward a new financial system, setting up regional currency blocks, trade of national currencies. So the question that's posed here is, when will the population in the West wake up? We saw a good start last week with the demonstrations in Germany, demonstrations in Washington, D.C. But there's still this continued effort from Biden, from Ursula von der Leyen and the European Union, from Sunak in Great Britain, these puppets of the cartels. What's an example of this? Janet Yellen, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, was in Kiev earlier this week to give $1.25 billion to the Kiev regime. For what? To pay for police, fire, and schools. $1.25 billion out of a $45 billion package voted up by the Congress back in December. The Congress, which is selling out your interests to continue the war in Ukraine. Now, how do we have money to pay firemen and policemen and school teachers in Ukraine when the Biden administration turned its back on the toxic cloud that was covering the town of East Palestine, Ohio? So the question is, will you continue to allow the U.S. to spend hundreds of billions of dollars to defeat Russia and hundreds of billions more to go to war with China, to continue a collapsing world order which no one in their right mind could support? Only the billionaires could support it, and people deluded by a media which lies to keep you submissive. So I urge you to watch the video on the Syrian sanctions and become active with us in opposing this unipolar order. It's going to be gone at some point soon. The question is, will it take all the rest of us with it? Thanks for joining me. I'll see you again tomorrow.